I want to start this morning by asking you to think about safety. If I were to ask you to think of a person who is safe, or a place that is safe, or a time in your life that you felt safe, I want you to reflect on that. And when you have that in your mind, just raise your hand. I will not make you say it out loud. A person, a place, a time that felt safe. Anyone? When I was finishing my university studies, I was making a decision about whether I was going to go into mission through the United Methodist Church, or whether I was going to be engaged in continuing work against this supermax prison that was being built in Ohio. And I knew that the decision was an important decision in my life, and I knew that I couldn't make it in my dorm room. And I found my way 6.5 hours later to my grandmother's house, which was and still is to this day one of the safest places I have ever known. And I knew I just needed to be there with her. One of the things that I most loved about that season in my life is that she didn't push me to have a dialogue about what exactly I needed to decide. And in fact, she knew that more than just being in that space, I needed to go with her to the shoreline of Lake Michigan. My grandmother was in love with the shoreline of Lake Michigan, and she would always walk barefoot on the sand. It didn't matter how cold it was, how strong the wind was, how high the waves were. I have some of my most favorite pictures of her, barefoot sitting on a log with a jacket on and the wind in her hair. She knew that I needed to be there, and that the safety of being with her and being in that place and being in that moment was part of what I needed to be able to make the decisions that I had before me. I want you to think about times in your life when you knew you were at a crossroad, times in your life when you knew that what you were choosing would have consequences long beyond what you were standing in that moment, and who you sought out, or who you longed to speak to, or where you longed to be. I believe that part of what Jesus is teaching us in this John 10 passage is that there is safety in God's presence. And I want you to consider that you and I are far better, far stronger, far more deeper in our capacity to love and forgive and to walk with others when we feel safe. In fact, the long arc of our lives, when we know a safety in God's presence, or in a space that has felt like the fullness of God's embrace, the long arc of our lives tends towards something more powerful, because safety is that important. Now, I want to take a pause here, because I want to talk also about the fact that we can use safety in our lives to act up. I want you to raise your hand if you have ever used a relationship, a space, a person to act up, to act out, to act crazy because you knew it was safe to do so. I learned this concept from my mother, who is here worshiping with us today, because when my children were small and they would be with their grandmother, they were like angelic, right? Who are these children? And I would take them home and they would act crazy. And I was convinced that she was far better of a mother than I could ever possibly be, and that I was doomed to fail at this thing called parenting, until she said to me, "It's because they're safe with you." What? It's because they trust you. It's because you are the place that they feel like they can both fully express who they are. That learning, I actually pray that that's true, because if not, there's a lot of other things in my parenting that I need to review. But I believe that there is something to be said about the spaces that are safe, enable us to act out, to act up, and sometimes that's not okay. Have you been hurt by somebody acting up in their safe space? Yes, right? I'm really convinced that at the end of my life, if you want to know if I have been faithful, don't ask my church. Ask my husband. Ask my children. Ask my parents if they're around. Ask my best friend. Because those are the spaces that I get to be fully who I am. Those are the places where authentically you will see whether who I am is reflecting who God calls me to be, because those are the places and the spaces and the relationships that I am beloved, not because of what I do, not because of what I say. In fact, sometimes not because of anything at all except for the fact that there is the gift of love. And so I want you to consider what it means to stand in God's safety. Not every one of us have felt safety in the places that we most longed for it, right? Raise your hand if you know that to be true. Not every space that should have been safe was. But the power of the gospel and the power of what Jesus is teaching us through this John 10 is that regardless of what we have walked through and the ways in which we have let each other down, regardless of where we have been, there is one good shepherd. There is a God who creates a space that is safe, and when you find the ability to stand in the safety that the Good Shepherd creates, it has a profound impact on every other element of your life. Because when we know at the core of who we are that we are beloved and worthy and called and seen and heard and understood and loved beyond our imperfections, it changes our capacity to face hardship. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, because you are with me, because you have my hand. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You even prepare a table before the presence of my enemies, and you anoint my head with oil, and the cup of my life, what? Runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord. It was my grandmother's house, but there is a better house. It was somebody's love for you, but there is a better love. It was some period in your life, but there is an eternity to be in the fullness of the presence of the Good Shepherd. And God suggests that when we know and claim that, it changes who we are. I want us to go back to that John 10 passage. And I want us to consider that Jesus says anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in any other way, is a thief and a bandit. Has anybody ever climbed in your life uninvited? Right? I actually had somebody say to me last week, this was a powerful word to me. She said to me, Jen, not everybody gets the right to speak in your life. I thought, oh. She said, not everybody gets to tell you what they see. In fact, that is a privilege that you give someone, and not everybody gets the ability to come in to the sheepfold. The one who enters by the gate, says Jesus, is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out, and when he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger, but they will run from the stranger because they do not know the voice of the stranger. Jesus used this figure of speech with them, but they didn't understand what he was saying. I want you to know that in Palestine in Old Testament times, a sheepfold was constructed. It was a closed-in area where the sheep were kept safe, and there was one entry point into the sheepfold. And who was there at the entrance to the sheepfold? Who stood guard at the sheepfold? The shepherd. It makes me think of lock-ins, Pastor Tammy. It makes me think of youth ministry and having teenagers in one room and literally getting so frustrated one night that I pulled my sleeping bag and extended my body across the doorway. Nobody who is not allowed will enter, and none of you all crazy people are going to leave. Because the shepherd stands at the gate. Sometimes we need God to give us the strength to keep out which is not of him. And sometimes we need God to keep us in when our hearts tend to wander and get lost. Jesus is that gatekeeper that keeps us in this safe space. And I want you to consider how deeply your life changes when you find a place that is truly safe to stand. Now, I didn't think about this, but I was reading commentaries in preparation for today. And if you remember last week, I shared with you that the Gospel of John has this pattern of miracle or sign, dialogue, and then discourse. Do you remember me saying that? Miracle or sign, dialogue, and then discourse. So in this part of the Gospel of John, I asked myself, what miracle is Jesus responding to? And commentaries actually suggest that Jesus is referring to the miracle in John 9 that we studied last week. Now, what did Jesus do in John 9? There was a man who was born blind. And what did Jesus do? He put spit on the ground, wiped mud on this man's face who never once asked Jesus to enter. And then this man who was blind from birth and accused of being punished for his sin, Jesus says to everybody who asks, this is not about his sin. And this man is able to do what? To see. Now, if that was the sign, what's the dialogue? Who talks to the man after he is given the ability to see? The Pharisees. You're right, Diane. And not only did they talk to him once, they start out with one line of questioning. Tell me who did this, and tell me how he did this, and tell me where he is. And the man who was born blind, who now can see, says, I don't know who he is. I don't know where he is. All I can tell you is that he spit on the ground, put mud on my eyes, and now I can see. But they intensify in their dialogue, in their questioning of the man. And finally, in John 9, we find this man in the temple, and one would think that he's standing in the temple to be able to declare what God has done, right? Have you ever stood up to give witness to what God has done, and somebody else wanted to distract from the miracle of God in your life? Lord. The man is trying to tell his story, and the Pharisees keep questioning him in the temple. Well, are you a follower of this man? And what is his possibility? And do you believe that he is a prophet? And do you believe that he is the Son of God? And the whole dialogue ends with the Pharisees doing what? This is important. They kick him out. They kick him out of the temple. Who goes to find him outside of the temple? Jesus. The next time the religious leaders kick you out, make sure you know that Jesus is going to meet you on the other side. The next time that somebody has more judgment for you than they do grace, know that Jesus is waiting for you at the doorway. In fact, Jesus is the one sleeping at the gate. Jesus is the one who lets in and lets out. Jesus is the one who comes to this man who has literally been expelled from community and says to him, not only am I the Son of Man, do you believe, but I give you the fullness of the community of the saints of light. And this John 10 passage then becomes Jesus' discourse. The commentary says when Jesus starts in John 10 verse 1, what are his first words? Very truly. They say this is an indication when Jesus is about to give a sermon. I'm going to start every sermon with very truly. Jesus starts this discourse, and he's actually talking about the difference between God and between the religious leaders. Because the ones who are hired climb in from another way. They become thieves. They become bandits. They become robbers. But there is one whose love is complete and pure and full. I want to go back to safety. When you are not safe, how do you start to act? When you are not safe, what starts to happen inside of you? Do you live in fear? And fear is actually something that God gives us to indicate that something is not right. But when we live in fear for years and years, when we hold on to trauma that continues to imprison our hearts, we become directed by our fear. When we live in fear, it's very hard to live into the fullness of God. When you don't feel safe, do you find yourself actually judging more? Anyone? When we're not safe, we tend to hide behind judgment. We see in somebody else and feel the need to point out in their life what we want nobody to see or uncover in our own. Sarai Segura, who helped to lead on Friday night in the Bible study that we are doing in the community Friday nights, began the study by asking the question, how many of you go to bed at night second-guessing choices or decisions you have made all day? Raise your hand. Everybody around that table, raise their hand. How much of our time is caught up in the unsafety of second-guessing ourselves? How many times do we not forgive because we believe somehow that our hardened heart will become a wall that protects us against more pain? One of the women in that Friday night Bible study, a woman who has gone through deep betrayal, raised her hand and said, I used to believe that unforgiveness kept me safe. I learned that unforgiveness hurt me more than it ever touched the person that I thought I was protecting myself from. We desire ill for those who have hurt us because we falsely believe that somehow that will protect us from another attack. We numb ourselves with overwork or overeating or overmedicating so that we don't have to feel all the feelings that make us feel unsafe. We choose not to extend grace to ourselves. We question the work of God in other people's lives. And we use our power to kick them out, as opposed to use what God is doing in each of our lives. It's part of why dealing with trauma is so important. Because when our soul has not been safe, and we don't work through the process of healing, that little person inside that has felt afraid, it takes them a lifetime to relearn that there is a good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. When we know what it means to walk in the safety of the fullness of God's love, it changes not only how we see ourselves, but how we see the world around us. The other powerful part of this John 10 passage is the way in which Jesus emphasizes that the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. There are some who suggest that Jesus didn't make a choice to sacrifice himself, that God had required that of Jesus. But that makes no sense theologically, because we need and we want a God who chooses to pay the price for your sin and mine, to free us into the valleys that lead us through the hard places. We need a God that freely chooses to lay down his life, but also a God who has the power to do what? To pick it back up again. I need a God who serves me because I cannot save myself. And I need a God that is powerful enough to not only lift me up, but lift up this world, that he would be lifted up high and mighty. I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold, Jesus says. I love this because even in this moment that Jesus is teaching, he's suggesting that even those that we think don't belong, even those who are non-Jews, Jesus says, I have other people, other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice so that there will be one flock and one shepherd. Not 59,000 denominations that spend their life fighting each other, as opposed to walking in the power that God gives. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay down my life in order to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord, and I have the power to lay it down and the power to take it up. I have received this command from my Father. Do you know how powerful and safe the love of God truly is? Jesus says, come and try. Come and see who I am. I want to go now to 1 Samuel 16 because I believe there's themes that intersect here. In 1 Samuel 16, we actually encounter Samuel, who God is saying, stop grieving over Saul. He's not the king that you wanted. He's not the one who's going to continue as king. Fill your horn with oil and set out. I will send you to Jesse, for I have provided for myself a king. And Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hears of it, he will kill me. Samuel does not feel safe, and he shouldn't. Saul's crazy, literally crazy. Saul is violent and moves back and forth in what he wants and what he needs. And he's very, very vindictive. And yet God says to Samuel, I'm with you. Take a heifer with you and say, I've come to sacrifice. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice. Nobody's going to know. The people see Samuel coming. They know that Samuel is in conflict with King Saul, and they're afraid, and they ask Samuel, are you coming peaceably? This world is scary with reason sometimes, but God is with Samuel. Samuel says, yes, I'm coming peaceably. He meets Jesse and begins this process of trying to discern who is the next king that God is calling. Now, pay attention. Jesus says in John 10 that he is the good shepherd, and the sheep do what? They hear his voice. They know who he is because they have attuned their hearts and their lives to listen to him. And here in this passage, Samuel is with Jesse, and Jesse parades his sons in front. How many sons go by? 7. In Scripture, 7 is considered a biblical number that indicates what? Completion or perfection. So wouldn't a most perfect God choose the 7th, the most perfect one? No, sir. After all of the sons have paraded, I love Samuel's faithful leadership. He doesn't know who it is, but he knows that it's not any of those who have come. And he turns to Jesse and he says, there has to be somebody else. And Jesse says, well, there's David. He's out in the fields taking care of the sheep. Call for him, Samuel says. And David comes. And the extraordinary faithfulness of both of Samuel and Jesse and David, in that moment, David is anointed secretly as the king because Saul is still the king. And yet somehow these 3 men hear the voice of God and trust the good shepherd. David is anointed and grows to be the greatest king that Israel has ever seen. Yes? And what else about David? Did he sin? What'd David do? Give me the short version. Lots of stuff, Diane says. Yes, he did. David did lots of stuff. Give me the big one that we all talk about. Bathsheba. David was adulterous. He literally had an affair with Bathsheba. She became pregnant. And yet I want you to know that not only in 1 Samuel 13 and 1 Samuel 16 do we hear God speaking of David's heart, all the way in the book of Acts in the New Testament, God still talks about David as a man after God's own heart. Because you don't have to be the perfect number 7 to be chosen by God. You don't have to live a life without sin to receive the unending, perfect love of God. Turn to somebody and say, God's love doesn't depend on your perfection. Tell somebody, God's love does not depend on your perfection. Because if it did, there would be no reason to die on the cross. There would be no reason to lay down life. We do not earn the place of safety. We receive it as a gift. David's great-grandmother was Ruth, the Moabite woman, the non-Hebrew woman who demonstrated faithfulness. David's great-grandfather was Boaz, the kinsman redeemer, the man who literally redeemed Ruth from her point of poverty. In David's lineage, there is Rahab, the prostitute, who literally leads the spies to be able to see the promised land. God is not looking for perfection. And the safety of God's love does not depend on your perfect life or mine. I want to end by going back to the John text. There was a man born blind at birth. And a whole world full of fear judged him and accused him, determined that his sin was the cause of his blindness. The man never even asked for healing. Jesus walked by, spit on the ground, put mud on his eyes, and he could see. And he told the story again and again and again. And they criticized him, and they made fun of him, and they accused him. And they came up with 1,000 reasons why he could not be, and Jesus could not be, anything more than a lie. And they kicked him out. And in that place, Jesus met him intentionally. Jesus wasn't just passing by. He went to find him. He left the 99 for the one. He finds him outside the temple. He speaks to him about eternal life and restores to him, N.T. Wright says, the gift of community. Because the hired hands tried to take it away. And then N.T. Wright says, we look at this text at John 10, and we think it's just about pastors and shepherds and sheep. And we've built a whole cult of personality around pastors, right? In Spanish, this sermon is very hard to preach because shepherd and pastor are the same word, literally, pastor. We've built a whole cult of personality around shepherds that pastor their sheep. And yet Jesus says there is one good shepherd, one who stands at the gate, one who holds the keys to the depth of love that God has. And N.T. Wright says the passage is not about pastors. The passage is about Jesus at the center. Jesus at the center as we start to make our way into Jerusalem. John 11, where Jesus brings Lazarus back to life. John 12, where Mary anoints Jesus' feet. John 13, where Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. John 14 and 15 and 16, the crucifixion. The Gospel of John spends more time in the Passion story than any other gospel at all, till we get to John 20, and Jesus, who has laid down his life, has the power to do what? Take it back up again. And in John 21, who gets restored? Peter. Peter. Do you love me, Peter? Then feed my sheep. Do you love me, Peter? Feed my sheep. Do you love me, Peter? Lord, you know that I love you. Feed my sheep. It's not about shepherds or pastors. It's about the Christ who calls you to who you are made to be.
Been walking the same old road for miles and miles. If you've been hearing the same old voice tell the same old lies. If you're trying to fill the same old holes inside, but there's a better life. There's a better life. If you've got pain